Torak had seen war on 37 worlds. He had watched the Drelkin burn entire forests to flush out their enemies. He had documented the Pelori siege tactics that lasted decades without a single soldier losing patience. He had studied the cold, mechanical warfare of the Venn Collective, where every death was calculated like a math problem. He believed with every fiber of his being that he understood war better than any living creature in the galaxy. That belief died the moment he stepped aboard the human warship Indomitable. The galactic hegemony had sent him as an observer. Humanity was still new to the stars, barely 200 years into their expansion beyond their home system. They had been granted provisional membership in the hegemony, but nobody trusted them yet. They were loud, they bred too fast, and died too quickly, and they had a troubling habit of getting involved in conflicts that had nothing to do with them. Torak's mission was simple: watch the humans, record their military behavior, report back to the Council with his findings. He expected it would be a boring assignment. He expected to find a young species playing at war with stolen technology and borrowed strategies. He expected to write a short, dismissive report and move on to something more interesting. He was wrong about all of it. The docking bay of the Indomitable was chaos. There was no other word for it. Soldiers moved in every direction, shouting to each other across the wide metal floor. Crates of supplies were being loaded and unloaded at the same time, and somewhere in the middle of it all, a young woman with short black hair was standing on top of a transport vehicle, yelling orders that somehow cut through all the noise. That was Lieutenant Yoon Nari. She noticed Torak immediately. It was hard not to notice him. He was tall, even by the standards of his own people, with pale blue skin and 4 eyes arranged in a diamond pattern across his face. He wore the gray robes of a hegemony scholar, and he carried a recording device strapped to his left arm. Nari jumped down from the vehicle and walked toward him. She did not salute, she did not bow. She simply looked at him with sharp dark eyes and said, "You must be the observer." "I am Torak of the 3rd Academic Circle," he said, using his formal title. "I have been assigned to document your military operations for the Galactic Council." "Great," Nari said. "Try not to get in the way." Before Torak could respond, she was already walking away, shouting something about ammunition counts to a soldier who was twice her size. The soldier nodded quickly and ran off. Torak stood alone in the middle of the docking bay, feeling very small for the first time in a long time. He was taken to the bridge an hour later. The bridge of the Indomitable was not what he expected. On hegemony warships, the bridge was always quiet and controlled. Officers spoke in low voices. Screens displayed information in neat, organized rows. Everything was calm and precise. The human bridge was different. There were screens everywhere, some of them showing data that Torak could not even begin to understand. Officers were talking over each other, and there was a low hum of energy in the room that felt almost physical. In the center of it all, sitting in a worn leather chair that looked like it had been through 100 battles, was Captain Han Do-hyun. Do-hyun was not a large man. He was average in height, with a lean build and a face that looked like it had been carved from stone. His hair was dark and cut short, and there were lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent staring into the void of space. He wore his uniform loosely, the top button undone, and there was a small scar on his left cheek that he never bothered to explain. When Torak entered the bridge, Do-hyun looked up from a datapad and studied him for a long moment. Then he smiled. It was a small smile, barely there, but it changed his entire face. "Welcome aboard," Do-hyun said. His voice was calm and steady, the kind of voice that made people listen without needing to be loud. "I hope you find what you are looking for." "I am here to observe your methods of warfare," Torak said carefully. "The Council wishes to understand how humanity fights." Do-hyun leaned back in his chair. That is a big question, he said. You might not like the answer. Turok did not understand what he meant by that. He would understand later. Over the next several days, Turok settled into the rhythm of the ship. He watched everything. He recorded everything, and slowly he began to notice things that confused him. The soldiers on this ship did not behave like soldiers on any other ship he had ever visited. They laughed too much. They touched each other constantly, clapping shoulders, bumping fists, ruffling hair. They argued about food and music and something called football, and their arguments were loud and passionate, and ended just as suddenly as they began, usually with laughter. He met Sergeant Kwon Ji-seok on his third day. Ji-seok was a big man with broad shoulders and hands that looked like they could crush metal. He led one of the ground assault teams, and his soldiers clearly adored him. Turok watched him spend 20 minutes helping a young private fix a jammed rifle, patient and gentle despite his size. Then he watched the same man lift a training dummy over his head and throw it across a room during combat practice, roaring like an animal. He also met Bae Yuna, the chief medic. Yuna was small and quiet, with soft eyes and steady hands. She smiled at everyone, even Turok, and she had a habit of humming old songs while she organized her medical supplies. She seemed like the least dangerous person on the entire ship. Do not let her fool you, Nari told Turok one evening. Yuna once performed surgery on a soldier in the middle of a firefight. The enemy was 10 meters away. She did not even flinch. Turok wrote that down in his notes, but he did not believe it, not yet. On the 7th day, everything changed. The distress signal came in at 0300 hours, ship time. It was weak and broken, cutting in and out through waves of static. But the message was clear enough. A colony on the planet Arion 4 was under attack. The enemy was a raider fleet from the outer systems, well-armed and ruthless. The colony had no military defenses. They were civilians, farmers, families. They were not human. The colony was Pelori. Turok expected the humans to ignore it. The Pelori were not their allies. There was no treaty, no obligation, no strategic reason to intervene. Any rational species would have noted the signal and continued on their course. Captain Han Do-hyun stood up from his chair. He looked at the message on the screen for exactly 3 seconds. Then he turned to his crew and said 2 words: change course. Nobody questioned it. The entire ship turned toward Arion 4, and Turok felt the engines beneath his feet roar to life with new purpose. He stared at Do-hyun's back and thought, for the first time, that he might have been wrong about humans. He had no idea how wrong he truly was. The Indomitable moved fast, faster than Turok thought a ship of its size could move. The engines hummed with a deep, constant vibration that he could feel in his bones, and the entire crew shifted into a state of focused activity that was unlike anything he had seen before. It was not the cold efficiency he had witnessed on hegemony warships. It was something else entirely, something alive. Within 1 hour of the course change, every department on the ship was preparing for battle. Weapons teams ran diagnostics on every cannon and missile system. Engineering crews checked and rechecked the shield generators. The flight deck buzzed with pilots running through their pre-mission routines, climbing in and out of their small attack craft with practiced ease. Turok followed Lieutenant Yoon Nari through the corridors as she moved from section to section, checking on progress. She walked fast, and he had to stretch his long legs to keep up. She spoke into her communicator constantly, giving orders and receiving updates. And she did all of this without ever looking at a datapad or a screen. She kept everything in her head. How long until we reach Arion 4? Turok asked, slightly out of breath. 14 hours, Nari said, without slowing down. Maybe less if engineering can push the drives harder. And the plan? Nari glanced at him. There was something in her eyes that he could not quite read. The plan is to get there before everyone dies. It was not the kind of detailed tactical answer Torak was used to. But he was beginning to learn that humans did not always plan the way other species did. They adapted. They improvised. They made decisions in the moment and trusted each other to fill in the gaps. It terrified him. He found Sergeant Kwan Jisiok in the mess hall 6 hours before the expected arrival. The large man was sitting at a table with his entire squad, and they were eating. Not quickly, not efficiently, but slowly. They were enjoying their food. They were talking and laughing, and someone had brought a small speaker that was playing music, something with a slow beat, and a woman singing in a language Torak did not recognize. Torak stood in the doorway and watched them. On every other warship he had studied, the hours before combat were spent in silence. Soldiers would meditate, or review tactical data, or simply sit alone with their thoughts. The Drelkin performed ritual prayers to their war gods. The Ven Collective ran final system checks on their cybernetic enhancements. These humans were eating noodles and laughing about something that had happened during training 3 weeks ago. Jisok noticed him standing there and waved him over. "You look like you have not eaten in days." Torak hesitated, then walked over and sat at the edge of the table. A young soldier with a round face and bright eyes pushed a bowl toward him. "Try this," the soldier said. "Yuna made it. She is a terrible medic, but a great cook." "I heard that, Taewon," a voice called from across the table. Bei Yuna was sitting at the far end. Her small frame almost hidden behind a stack of medical supply boxes she had brought to sort through while she ate. She pointed a pair of chopsticks at the young soldier. "And I am an excellent medic." "You are an excellent everything," Jisok said, and the whole table laughed. Torak looked down at the bowl. It was some kind of soup with thick noodles and vegetables and slices of something soft and white. It smelled warm. He picked up the eating sticks the humans used and tried to bring some noodles to his mouth. The soldiers watched him struggle for a moment, and then Jisok gently took the sticks from his hands and showed him the correct grip. "Like this," Jisok said. "Relax your fingers. Do not fight the food." Torak tried again. This time, he managed to get the noodles to his mouth. The taste was unlike anything he had experienced. It was warm and salty and rich, and something about it made him feel a strange sense of comfort that he could not explain. "Good?" Jisok asked. "Yes," Torak admitted. "Very good." Jisok smiled, and for a moment, he did not look like a man who was about to go to war. He looked like someone sitting in his own home, sharing a meal with people he loved. That was the thing Torak could not understand. These soldiers were not just comrades. They were family. They teased each other and argued with each other and took care of each other in ways that went far beyond military duty. He watched Yuna reach across the table to wipe a spot of soup from Taewon's cheek, and the young soldier blushed and pushed her hand away, and everyone laughed again. How could they laugh? They were flying toward a battle they might not survive. The raiders attacking Arion 4 were known to be brutal and well-equipped. The odds were not in their favor. Any rational calculation would suggest that some of the people at this table would not be alive tomorrow. And yet, they laughed. Later, Torak found Captain Han Do-hyun alone in the observation deck. The large window showed the streaking lines of stars as the ship traveled at high speed. Do-hyun was standing with his hands behind his back, staring out at the light. Torak stood beside him in silence for a long time. Then he asked the question that had been building inside him all day. "Why did you change course?" Do-hyun did not look at him. "Because they asked for help. They are not your people. You have no treaty with them, no obligation. Helping them puts your crew at risk for no strategic gain." Do-hyun was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Do you have children, Torak?" The question surprised him. "No." "I do not either," Do-hyun said. But there are children on that colony, Pelori children. And right now, they are scared and alone and waiting for someone to come. I do not need a treaty to answer that call. Torok opened his mouth to argue, to explain that war was not about emotion, that tactical decisions should not be made based on the fear of children on a world that was not your own. But something in Do-hyun's voice stopped him. There was no doubt in it, no hesitation. This man had made his decision, and it was as solid and unshakable as the metal walls of his ship. You think we are strange, Do-hyun said, finally turning to look at Torok. His dark eyes were calm but deep, like water that looks still on the surface, but moved with powerful currents underneath. I think you are illogical, Torok said honestly. Do-hyun smiled that small smile again. Maybe, but logic never saved anyone who was screaming for help. 3 hours before arrival, the ship grew quiet. The laughter and the music faded, and something else took its place. Torok felt it like a change in pressure, a shift in the air itself. The soldiers were still moving, still preparing, but there was a weight to their movements now, a seriousness that had not been there before. He passed Jisake in the corridor. The big man was carrying his combat armor over one shoulder, and his face was different. The warmth was still there, buried deep, but on the surface there was something hard and sharp. He nodded at Torok as he passed, but did not speak. Yuna was in the medical bay, laying out surgical tools in neat rows. Her hands moved with the same steady rhythm as always, but her eyes were distant. She was humming again, that same old song, but this time it sounded sad. Nari was on the bridge, standing behind her station with her arms crossed. She was watching the navigation display, counting down the minutes. When she spoke, her voice was flat and precise, every word carefully chosen. All teams report ready, she said. Drop in 2 hours and 47 minutes. Captain Do-hyun sat in his chair and placed his hands on his knees. He closed his eyes, just for a moment. When he opened them again, something had changed in his face. The calm was still there, but beneath it, Torok could see something burning, something old and fierce and deeply, terribly human. Tell the crew, Do-hyun said quietly. We are going to bring them home. Torok gripped his recording device tightly. His hands were shaking. He did not know why. He had observed dozens of pre-battle preparations on dozens of ships across the galaxy. None of them had ever made his hands shake. But none of them had ever felt like this. None of them had ever felt like a family walking together into fire. He pressed the record button and whispered into his device, I am beginning to think I have made a serious mistake in my assumptions about this species. It was the most honest thing he had ever recorded. The planet Arion 4 was burning. Torok could see it from the bridge as the Indomitable dropped out of high-speed travel and entered the system. The planet was a small green world, covered in wide plains and gentle hills. The kind of quiet place where farming colonies thrived. But now, thick columns of black smoke rose from the surface, visible even from orbit. The raider fleet hung in the space above the planet, like dark insects feeding on a wound. There were 9 raider ships. The Indomitable was alone. Torok counted the enemy vessels on the tactical display and felt his stomach drop. 9-1. The raiders were not the largest ships he had ever seen, but they were fast and heavily armed, built for quick strikes and brutal efficiency. Their hulls were covered in scorch marks and dents, evidence of dozens of previous attacks on defenseless colonies. These were not soldiers. They were predators. Her voice was calm, almost bored. Captain Han Do-hyun looked at the display for exactly 2 seconds. I can count, Lieutenant. Just making sure, sir. Do-hyun leaned forward in his chair. Launch fighters, all batteries to combat status. Nari, find me a gap in their formation. Already found one, sir. Their lower wing is spread thin. If we punch through there, we can get our dropships to the surface. Do it. The Indomitable surged forward, and Torak grabbed the railing beside him to keep his balance. The ship shook as the first volley of weapons fire erupted from its cannons, bright lines of energy streaking across the black space toward the raider fleet. The raiders responded immediately, turning their ships to face the incoming threat, and the void between them lit up with explosions. Torak had seen space battles before. He had watched the Drelkin fleet engagements from a safe distance, and he had reviewed hundreds of hours of recorded combat footage from across the galaxy. He thought he knew what battle looked like. He was wrong. Human space combat was not elegant. It was not precise. It was violent and loud and messy, and the Indomitable flew through it like a beast let loose from a cage. The ship took hits that would have crippled a hegemony cruiser, and it kept moving. Alarms screamed, panels sparked, a section of the ceiling above Torak cracked and showered him with dust. And through it all, the crew kept working. Nari's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. She called out targets and coordinates without pause, her eyes moving across 3 different screens at once. Do-hyun sat in his chair like a stone in a river, steady and unmoved while the world crashed around him. He gave orders in short, sharp sentences, and his crew obeyed without question. The dropships launched in the middle of the battle, 6 small craft, barely armored, carrying ground teams straight through the crossfire toward the planet below. Torak watched them on the tactical screen, tiny dots moving through a storm of weapons fire, and he could not believe what he was seeing. "They will be destroyed," he said out loud. Nobody heard him, or if they did, nobody cared. But the dropships were not destroyed. They twisted and turned through the fire with a reckless skill that defied logic, and one by one, they broke through the battle and dove toward the surface. Only one was hit, taking damage to its left engine, and even that one kept flying, trailing smoke as it disappeared into the atmosphere. On the surface, it was worse. Torak was not on the ground. He watched everything through the helmet cameras of the soldiers, fed directly to the bridge screens. The footage was shaky and chaotic, filled with the sound of gunfire and shouting, and the heavy breathing of soldiers running through smoke. The colony was a small settlement of low buildings, surrounded by crop fields. Half the buildings were on fire. Bodies lay in the streets. Most of them were Palori, their pale silver skins stained dark with dust and blood. Some of them were very small. Torak looked away from the screen for a moment, and then forced himself to look back. Sergeant Kwon Ji-seok was the first one off the dropship. Torak watched through his helmet camera as the big man hit the ground running, his rifle up and ready. Behind him, his squad fanned out with practiced speed, moving between the burning buildings like shadows. "Contact left," someone shouted, and the air erupted with weapons fire. The raiders on the ground were armored and aggressive, firing from behind barricades they had built from the wreckage of destroyed buildings. They had been here long enough to dig in, and they fought with the casual cruelty of people who were used to attacking those who could not fight back. They were not used to fighting humans. Ji-seok moved through the battle like a force of nature. He was big and fast and completely without fear, and his rifle never stopped firing. But it was not his shooting that shocked Torak. It was what he did between the shots. Midway through the first push into the colony, Ji-seok spotted a Palori civilian trapped under a collapsed wall. The civilian was small, probably young by Palori standards, and was crying out in a language Torak did not understand. There were raiders firing from a building 30 meters away. Bullets struck the ground around Ji-seok's feet, sending up puffs of dirt and stone. Ji-seok did not hesitate. He ran to the fallen wall, slung his rifle over his back, and began lifting. The wall was heavy, made of thick stone blocks, and even with his considerable strength, it should have been impossible. but he lifted it. He roared with effort, veins standing out on his neck, and he lifted it just enough for the young Pelori to crawl free. Then he dropped the wall, grabbed the civilian with one arm, and ran for cover while bullets chased him every step of the way. He set the Pelori child down behind a solid wall, checked it for injuries with quick, gentle hands, and then unslung his rifle and went back to fighting. The entire thing took less than 40 seconds. Torak stared at the screen. His recording device was running, capturing every moment, but his mind could not process what he had just seen. This man had risked his life for a child that was not his species, not his people, not his responsibility. And he had done it without thinking, as naturally as breathing. On another screen, Torak watched Nari coordinate the battle from the bridge. She had a map of the colony on her display, and she was directing the ground teams with surgical precision. She knew where every squad was, where every pocket of enemies was hiding, and she moved her people like pieces on a game board, always one step ahead. But there was something else in her voice, something that Torak had not noticed before. Every time she directed fire toward a raider position, she paused for just a fraction of a second afterward. It was so brief that nobody else seemed to notice, but Torak noticed. And when the camera on a nearby soldier's helmet caught a glimpse of a dead raider lying in the dirt, Torak heard Nari whisper something under her breath. He played it back on his recording device later. She had said, "I am sorry." She was apologizing to the enemy she had just killed. In the middle of a battle, with lives hanging in the balance, this woman was quietly saying sorry to the dead. On every world he had studied, killing in war was either celebrated or ignored. The Drelkin roared in triumph over their fallen enemies. The Ven collective simply moved on to the next target without acknowledgement. No species he had ever documented mourned the enemy during the fight itself. But humans did, or at least this human did. In the medical station set up behind the front lines, Bayuna was already working. The footage from the camera mounted above her station showed a small woman moving with incredible speed and focus. Wounded soldiers and Pelori civilians were being brought to her in a steady stream, and she treated each one with the same careful attention. She stitched a wound on a soldier's arm while calmly giving instructions to her assistants. She set a broken bone on a Pelori elder who was shaking with fear, speaking to him in soft tones, even though he could not understand her words. She held the hand of a young soldier named Taewan when he was brought in with shrapnel in his leg, and she told him he was going to be fine, and she said it with such absolute certainty that even Torak believed her. The battle raged on around her. The sound of explosions shook the walls of her makeshift station. Dust fell from the ceiling, and Yuna kept working, her hands steady, her voice calm, her eyes full of a quiet fire that never went out. Torak recorded all of it, every moment, every detail, and with each passing minute, he felt the foundations of everything he thought he knew about war begin to crack. These humans were not the primitive brutes he had expected. They were not the logical warriors of the hegemony. They were something else entirely, something that fought with fury and wept with compassion at the same time, something that killed with precision and mourned with sincerity in the same breath. He did not have a word for it, not in any language he knew, but it frightened him more than any weapon he had ever seen. The turning point came on the second day of fighting. The ground teams had pushed the raiders back to the eastern edge of the colony, reclaiming most of the settlement, building by building. It was slow and bloody work, but the humans were winning. The Pelori civilians who had survived were being gathered in a protected area near the medical station. And for the first time since the battle began, there was a feeling that the worst might be over. Then the raiders did something that changed everything. They had captured a group of Pelori during their initial attack on the colony. 43 civilians, mostly elderly and young, who had been too slow to hide, when the raiders came. The humans knew about the prisoners. GSOC's scouts had reported their location in a large storage building on the eastern edge, and Nari had been working on a rescue plan for hours. They never got the chance to use it. At midday, the raider commander broadcast a message on all frequencies. It was short. He said that if the humans did not withdraw from the planet within 1 hour, the prisoners would be executed. He said it calmly, as if he were discussing the weather. Then, to prove he was serious, the broadcast showed a live feed from inside the storage building. Torak was on the bridge when the feed appeared on the main screen. He watched. He wished he had not. The raiders killed 5 prisoners on camera. They did it slowly. They did it while the others watched. The screams of the Pelori filled the bridge of the Indomitable, and for a long, horrible moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Torak looked at the faces of the human crew around him. He expected to see fear. He expected to see doubt or hesitation, or the cold calculation of a species weighing the cost of continued engagement against the strategic value of retreat. He saw none of those things. He saw rage. It moved through the bridge like a wave. Torak could feel it in the air, heavy and electric, pressing against his skin. Officers who had been calm and professional for 2 days were gripping their consoles with white knuckles. A young communications officer had tears running down her face, but her jaw was set like iron. Nari stood at her station with her hands flat on the surface, and her entire body was trembling. Not with fear, with something far more dangerous. Torak turned to look at Captain Han Do-hyun. What he saw made his blood go cold. Do-hyun had not moved. He sat in his chair with his hands on his knees, exactly as he always did. His face was perfectly still. His eyes were fixed on the screen where the feed had been, though it had already been cut. There was no expression on his face at all. That was what frightened Torak. Not anger, not shouting, nothing. The man had become empty, like a weapon being loaded, like a storm that had gone silent before releasing its full power. Do-hyun spoke. His voice was quiet, quieter than Torak had ever heard it. And somehow, that quiet voice filled every corner of the bridge. Nari, sir, new orders. All ground teams advance. No retreat, no withdrawal. We take back every building, every street, every meter of ground, until we reach those prisoners. Roles of engagement, sir. Do-hyun paused. It was a pause that lasted exactly 2 heartbeats. Then he said, "They made their choice, match it." Torak did not fully understand what those words meant until he watched what happened next. On the ground, the change was immediate. Jisiok received the orders through his communicator, and Torak watched through his helmet camera as the big man's face transformed. The gentle warmth that Torak had come to associate with him was gone. In its place was something ancient and terrible. Jisiok looked at his squad, and they looked back at him, and something passed between them that needed no words. They moved. Torak had thought the humans were fighting hard before. He had been wrong. What they had been doing before was measured, controlled, careful. What they did now was something else entirely. Jisiok led his squad through the raider defenses like a hammer through glass. They did not sneak. They did not flank. They walked straight into the enemy fire, and they did not stop. Jisiok took a hit to his shoulder that spun him half around, and he kept moving. He fired his rifle until it overheated, dropped it, pulled out his sidearm, and kept firing. When that ran empty, he picked up a raider's weapon from the ground and used that instead. His squad was the same. Every one of them fought with a fury that Torak had never seen in any species. It was not mindless. That was the terrifying part. They were not out of control. They were perfectly aware of what they were doing. They moved together, covered each other, communicated with quick shouts and hand signals. But beneath that discipline was a fire that burned so hot it seemed to warp the air around them. The raiders broke. Torak had seen armies retreat before. He had seen organized withdrawals and panicked flights and everything in between. But he had never seen an enemy simply shatter the way the raiders did in the face of the human advance. They had been confident and cruel just hours ago. They threw down their weapons and ran, and the humans chased them through the burning streets without mercy. On the bridge, Nari directed the assault with a cold precision that was almost mechanical. She had stopped trembling. Her voice was flat and sharp, and she placed her strikes with devastating accuracy. Every time the raiders tried to regroup, she was already there, directing fire to break them apart before they could form a line. But it was in the medical station that Torak saw something that broke his understanding of humanity completely. The wounded were coming in faster now, both human and raider. As the battle turned, injured raiders began to surrender, and they were brought to the medical station along with the human wounded. Torak expected the humans to treat them differently, to make them wait, or to handle them roughly, or to simply refuse to help them at all. Yuna treated them exactly the same. She moved from a human soldier with a chest wound to a raider with a shattered leg without pausing. She cleaned and stitched and bandaged with the same careful hands, the same focused expression. One of the raiders was barely conscious, muttering in his own language, and Yuna held his hand while she worked on him and spoke to him in a gentle voice, even though neither of them could understand the other. Taehwan, the young soldier who had been treated earlier, was helping in the medical station despite his own injury. He brought water to the wounded raiders and held pressure on their wounds when Yuna asked him to. Torak watched the young man kneel beside an enemy who had been trying to kill his friends hours ago, and help him drink water from a cup, and he felt something inside himself crack open. He did not realize he had spoken out loud until Yuna looked up at him. "How what?" she asked, her hand still working on a wound. "How can you help them? They killed the prisoners. They killed civilians. They are the enemy." Yuna paused for just a moment. Then she looked at Torak with those soft, steady eyes and said, "They are hurt. That is enough." She went back to work. Torak stood there, unable to move, unable to speak. In that moment, he understood something that all his years of study and observation had never taught him. Humanity did not fight despite their compassion. They fought because of it. The same thing that made them weep for the dead made them rage against the killers. The same heart that drove Yuna to heal the enemy drove Jisok to charge through fire to save a stranger. It was all the same thing. It was all connected. And it was the most powerful force Torak had ever witnessed. On the bridge, Captain Do-hyun watched the tactical display as his forces closed in on the storage building where the remaining prisoners were being held. His face was still empty, still calm, still that terrible blankness that Torak now understood was not the absence of emotion, but the containment of something too vast to show. "Jisok," Do-hyun said into the communicator. "The prisoners." "We are 30 meters out, sir. I can see the building." "Bring them home, Sergeant." "Yes, sir." The camera feed showed Jisok and his squad approaching the storage building. The remaining raiders inside had barricaded the doors. Jisok did not slow down. He hit the barricade like a wall of force, and his squad poured in behind him. The fight inside lasted less than 2 minutes. When it was over, Jisok stood in the middle of the room, breathing hard, surrounded by the Polori prisoners who were still alive. There were 31 of them. 12 had not survived. Jisok knelt down beside a young Polori who was clutching a smaller one, probably a sibling. The young alien stared at this massive human with wide, terrified eyes. Jisok reached out with one blood-covered hand and gently, so gently, touched the young Polori's head. "You are safe now," he said. "I promise." On the bridge, Torak watched through blurred vision. It took him a moment to realize that his eyes were wet. His species did not cry. They had no tear ducts, no mechanism for it. But something was happening inside him that felt very much like weeping. Beside him, Captain Do-hyun let out a long, slow breath. And just for a second, just for a single moment that nobody else saw, the captain's hands shook. Then the moment passed, and he was stone again. "Nari," he said. "Status on the raider fleet. 3 ships destroyed, 4 disabled, 2 attempting to flee." Do-hyun's eyes narrowed. "Do not let them." The Indomitable turned its guns toward the fleeing ships, and the stars burned bright. The silence after battle was the loudest thing Torak had ever heard. The raider fleet was gone. The 2 ships that had tried to flee did not get far. The Indomitable had run them down with a cold efficiency that left no room for escape. The remaining raider ships in orbit were either burning wreckage or dead hulks drifting through space. On the ground, the last pockets of resistance had surrendered by evening, dropping their weapons and kneeling in the dirt with their hands behind their heads. Arion 4 was free, but the cost was everywhere. Torak went down to the surface on the 3rd day. He had asked Captain Do-hyun for permission, and Do-hyun had simply nodded, his face carrying the same quiet weight it had carried since the battle ended. The dropship descended through a sky that was still gray with smoke, and when Torak stepped out onto the ground, the smell hit him first. Burning wood, scorched earth, and something else. Something bitter and sad that he would later learn was the human word for grief. The colony was in ruins. Buildings that had stood for generations were now piles of broken stone and twisted metal. The crop fields that had fed the Pelori settlers were scorched black, stretching out like dark scars across the green land. Everywhere Torak looked, there were signs of what had happened. Bullet holes in walls, blast craters in the road, dark stains on the ground that he tried not to look at too closely. But there were also signs of something else, something that had come after the destruction. The humans were building. Torak walked through the settlement and watched in silence as human soldiers worked side by side with Pelori civilians. They were clearing debris from the streets, stacking stones, pulling apart destroyed buildings, and sorting the materials into piles that could be reused. A group of soldiers had set up large tents for the Pelori who had lost their homes, and Torak saw humans carrying children on their shoulders, helping elderly Pelori to sheltered areas, distributing food and water and blankets from the ship's own supplies. Sergeant Kwon Ji-seok was in the middle of it. His shoulder was bandaged where he had been shot during the assault, and he moved with a stiffness that suggested several more injuries he had not reported. But he was carrying a beam of wood on his good shoulder, helping to rebuild a wall that had collapsed. A group of Pelori children followed him everywhere he went, their silver faces bright with a curious trust that children seem to give freely, regardless of species. Ji-seok spoke to them in simple words and big gestures, and when one of the smallest children reached up to touch the bandage on his shoulder, he knelt down and let the child examine it with tiny, careful fingers. "Does it hurt?" the child asked in broken common language. Ji-seok smiled. The warmth was back in his face, though it sat alongside something heavier now. "A little," he said, "but I have had worse." The child looked at him with huge dark eyes. "You came to help us." "Yes." "Why?" Ji-seok was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because somebody had to." The child thought about this. Then it wrapped its small arms around Ji-seok's neck and held on. The big man closed his eyes and held the child gently, one large hand cradling its back, and he stayed like that for a long time. Torak turned away. He felt like he was watching something private. Something sacred. He found Bei Yuna in a building that had been converted into a temporary medical center. She had not slept in 2 days. Torak could see it in the shadows under her eyes, and the slight tremor in her hands that had not been there before. But she was still working. She was always working. The medical center was full. Human soldiers and Pelori civilians lay on makeshift beds, and Yuna moved between them with the same steady focus she had shown throughout the battle. But now, without the noise of combat to mask it, Torak could see the toll it was taking on her. She stopped beside a bed where a Pelori elder was sleeping. The elder had been wounded during the initial attack, and had nearly died during surgery. Yuna checked the elder's bandages, adjusted the flow of medicine through a tube, and then stood there for a moment, looking down at her patient with an expression that Torak had never seen on the face of a military medic. Pure and simple and completely without condition. Then she turned and walked to the next bed, where a wounded raider was lying with his eyes open, staring at the ceiling. The raider flinched when Yuna approached, his body tense, as if expecting to be struck. Yuna paused. She looked at the raider for a long moment. Then she checked his wounds, changed his bandages, and gave him water. "Thank you," the raider said in a hoarse voice. Yuna did not answer. She just nodded and moved on. But at the door of the medical center, she stopped. She put one hand on the wall and lowered her head, and her shoulders shook once, twice, 3 times. Then she straightened up, wiped her face with the back of her hand, and walked out into the sunlight. Torak followed her outside. He wanted to say something. He did not know what. "You must think we are very strange," Yuna said without turning around. "I think you are very many things," Torak said. "I do not have words for most of them." Yuna laughed. It was a small, tired laugh, but it was real. "That is probably the most honest thing anyone has ever said to me." They stood together in the thin sunlight, while the wind carried smoke across the ruined fields. Around them, humans and Pelori worked together, building something new from the ashes of something destroyed. The sound of hammers and voices filled the air. And somewhere in the distance, Torak could hear someone singing. That evening, the humans held a ceremony. They did it in a field just outside the colony, where the ground was still green and untouched by fire. Soldiers and Pelori gathered together as the sun went down, and the sky turned a deep orange that made the world look like it was glowing from within. They buried their dead first. 7 human soldiers had died in the battle, and their bodies were laid in the ground with great care. Each one was wrapped in the flag of their ship, and their names were spoken aloud by Captain Han Do-hyun, who stood at the head of the graves with his back straight and his voice clear. Torak did not know the soldiers who had died. He had not spoken to most of them, but he listened to their names, and he watched the faces of the people who had known them, and he felt the weight of every syllable. Then they buried the Pelori dead, all of them, every civilian who had been killed, including the 12 prisoners who had died in captivity. The humans dug the graves with their own hands, side by side with the graves of their own soldiers. Do-hyun spoke the Pelori names too, reading them from a list that Nari had compiled, pronouncing each one carefully, even though the sounds were foreign to his tongue. Then, last of all, they buried the raider dead. Torak almost did not believe it when he saw the soldiers begin digging the additional graves. The raiders had attacked a defenseless colony. They had killed civilians. They had executed prisoners. They had caused suffering and death and destruction, and the humans had fought and bled and died to stop them. And now they were burying them, with the same care, in the same field, under the same sky. Torak walked to where Do-hyun was standing after the ceremony. The captain looked tired, not just physically, but in a deeper way, in his bones and his soul. He was looking out at the rows of graves, human and Pelori and Raider all together, and his face was heavy with something that Torak finally recognized. It was grief, not for one side or the other, for all of them. "I do not understand you," Torak said. It was not an insult, it was a confession. Do-hyun turned to look at him. "What do you not understand?" "Everything. Why you came here. Why you fought so hard for people who are not your own. Why you healed the enemy. Why you bury them with honor. None of it makes sense. No rational species behaves this way." Do-hyun was quiet for a long time. The wind moved through the field, bending the grass around the graves. In the distance, Torak could see Jisek sitting with a group of Pelori children, teaching them some kind of hand game. He could see Yuna walking among the Pelori elders, checking on their health. He could see Nari standing alone at the edge of the field, her arms crossed, her face turned toward the sky. "Maybe that is the point," Do-hyun said at last. "Maybe being rational is not enough. Maybe it was never enough." He paused, and then he said something that Torak would carry with him for the rest of his life. "We do not fight because it makes sense, Torak. We fight because we cannot look at suffering and do nothing. That is not logic. That is not strategy. It is just who we are." Torak returned to his quarters that night and sat in front of his recording device for a long time. The small light blinked, waiting for him to speak. He had written hundreds of reports in his career. He had documented the warfare of dozens of species. He had always known the right words. Now, for the first time, the words did not come easily. He sat in the quiet of his room on this human warship, surrounded by a crew that laughed and wept and fought and healed with the same fierce, burning heart. And he tried to find a way to explain what he had witnessed to a council that had never seen anything like it. Finally, he pressed the button and spoke. "This is Torak of the 3rd Academic Circle. Final observation report on the human military vessel Indomitable and its crew." He paused, took a breath. "I have studied war for my entire life. I have watched 1,000 battles across 100 worlds. I have documented every strategy, every tactic, every method of killing that the galaxy has produced. I believed I understood conflict. I believed that war was a science, something to be measured and analyzed and predicted with precision." Another pause, longer this time. "I was wrong. I was completely and utterly wrong. Humanity does not wage war the way other species do. They do not fight with logic alone. They do not kill without feeling. They carry the weight of every life they take and every life they save, and that weight does not slow them down. It drives them forward." He looked at his hands. They were shaking again. "They fight not to conquer, but because they cannot bear injustice. They heal not because it is efficient, but because suffering is unacceptable to them. They bury their enemies not out of obligation, but because they believe that even in death, every being deserves dignity." He closed his eyes. "This is what makes them terrifying. Not their weapons, not their ships, not their strength, or their speed, or their numbers. It is the thing inside them that refuses to look away from pain. It is the thing that makes them cross the stars for strangers. It is the thing that allows them to hold a dying enemy's hand and weep." He opened his eyes and looked directly into the recorder. "I believed I knew war. Then I witnessed humanity unleashed. And now I know that I understood nothing at all." He pressed the button to stop the recording. The light went dark. In the silence that followed, somewhere on the decks below, a human voice was singing an old song. It drifted through the metal walls, soft and sad and beautiful. And Torak sat alone in the dark and listened until the song ended, and the ship carried them all forward into the quiet of the stars.